I love the 2022 dark comedy, The Menu. I put off seeing this movie for a long time. I don't necessarily like watching restaurant movies. It's not really fun to lay back and relax when you get home by watching a film about the thing you do for a living. I still haven't seen The Bear. I know. Jeremy Allen White is like line cook hot. Cool. The Menu follows a group of hyper-wealthy restaurant guests that visit the private island restaurant of Hawthorne. Everything's going well for the guests for like a full 2 minutes until the chef, played by Rafe Fiennes, announces that all of them are going to die by the end of the meal. And hilarity ensues. Something The Menu does that I find to be really interesting is that for the most part, you're overwhelmingly on the side of the restaurant workers and understand why they want to kill these people. They're in the 1%. This meal is the kind of thing that most people can't afford ever. And a lot of these people have been multiple times. This film successfully dehumanizes the restaurant guests to its audience in the same way that restaurant guests often dehumanize restaurant workers, which honestly I think is a little jarring for most people. And as someone who's worked in the restaurant industry for 10 years, in a morbid way that I hate to admit, I find it a little thrilling. Don't send angry mobs out for me, being like, oh, she's advocating for people to be turned into giant deconstructed s'mores and killed. Well, I mean, someone on TikTok once did tell me to eat the rich or whatever, and Karl Marx did say something about the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and I'm still very choked up about Box of the Horse being made into glue. Spoiler alert for Animal Farm, I guess, if you haven't read that at this point. This is my server lighter, so it's all very on theme still. So how did the restaurant industry get to be so bad? What does this have to do with tipping culture? What does dehumanization have to do with tipping? Are you just ranting? Was this just an excuse for you to get your gel lights out? Yeah, it was. But also, dehumanization is important to tipping culture because the way people are treated affects the way they treat others, and it affects their own well-being. And in a capitalistic society, the way people are paid is how we value them. In a psychological study done during COVID-19 on the effects it had on minority groups and restaurant workers, they said, servers and bartenders may feel coerced into tolerating discrimination from customers and staff in the spirit of, quote, the customer is always right, and creating a hostile work environment, and not creating a, quote, hostile work environment. And I've seen a lot of this happen firsthand. Many of those stories aren't my stories to tell, but I do have one. When I was 21, I had a larger party in my section. It was a group of 3 families taking their 18-year-old boys on a college tour in my hometown. One of the dads kept telling me how pretty I was and how lucky I was to have their sons in my section. I remember that the tables they were sitting at were separate. So I was standing in between those 2 tables taking some of their order, and I looked up and the dad had boxed me in between the 2 tables. This was like a really small space in between the tables, and he was right in my face, insisting that I give his sons my phone number and get the host's phone number for him. I was freaked out because he was inches away from me and I couldn't get out. later in the evening, when I handed in my checkout report to the manager and tried to laugh off the fact that I had a hard day, he looked at the tip that they left, looked at my male coworker, and jokingly said, "Sex sells." As if 20% absolves all sins. So if tipping absolves all sins, let's talk about tipping and where it came from. In America, we like to pretend we don't have aristocracy, but that's not necessarily true, and that's not necessarily how the wealthy see it. Rich Americans traveling through Europe in the 1850s and 60s learned about a medieval practice where lords would tip serfs who did a particularly good job at a task. So when these rich Americans arrived back in America, they started tipping because they wanted to be seen as a medieval aristocrat. Initially, there was a lot of pushback to this, as it was seen as classist, and how were the poor expected to give extra money on top? And this was also back when servers were paid an actual wage, so a tip was actually just a tip. This was a server getting a little extra on top. This American movement against tipping actually affected Europe, and that's why they don't have tipping. So, you're welcome, Europe. And next time you see a European getting all high and mighty on TikTok, you're welcome, Europe. Became the norm during the post-Civil War Reconstruction period. For many freed people, the only jobs available to them outside of sharecropping were servant jobs, bartending, railroad porter, and serving jobs. In the case of serving job and railroad porting jobs, there's a big catch there, that they weren't actually being paid. They were being tipped. So it was a way for employers to get away with not paying for labor, essentially continuing slave labor after slavery had ended. Since tipping was now a replacement for actual wages, it became immensely more popular. It's a way of killing two birds with one stone, where you can exploit labor costs and be racist at the same time. Two of our country's founding principles. Seriously, if you really think about most of the things we have done as a nation, it boils down to those two things: exploiting labor costs and being racist. Once tipping became the norm countrywide, in the 1960s, the federal minimum wage for servers is set at $2.13 an hour, and that is where it stays forevermore. My boss, Todd, when I interviewed him, pointed out that even in the 1990s, when he started working, the $2.13 an hour wasn't enough to cover taxes that are just taken out of your check. In the Times article I looked at for my research paper, a historian says the legacy of slavery is that it turned the tip in the United States from a bonus or an extra on top of a wage to the wage itself. One time, like 2 weeks before lockdown, I overheard this woman, when I was working at this upscale brunch restaurant, complaining about how her bridal dresses weren't going to get in time because COVID. I'm just saying, marshmallow. It's a solution. I think that tipping is an interesting thing because I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon. But the current system punishes back of house because they don't get tipped out. They get paid hourly, but they don't get any extra money if it's super busy. But then it also punishes front of house because they only rely on tips. And if it's slow, they don't make money. I've definitely been in positions at restaurants where I don't make an hourly wage. I make that $2.13, where I'm basically paying to work. Because you do still tip out people, especially in fine dining. You tip out your back weights based off your sales. So oftentimes, you can basically pay to work. Tipping is how the American restaurant industry functions now. When I interviewed Todd, the restaurant owner of the current restaurant I worked at, he mentioned how there have been plenty of restaurants that try to roll in the price of tipping into like the price of food or different things like that, and it doesn't necessarily work. And as a server who's been in the service industry for 10 years, people get really cranky when they think things are overpriced. I remember a few years ago when we started adding wellness check fees to things, which is just like a 3% fee at the bottom of a check that makes you know, like that lets you know that, hey, this fee isn't that we're overcharging you, it's that our employees have health care. And the amount of people that were so cranky about that, it was ridiculous. We need to take the current system we have and work within the parameters we have and do better with it. I really like the model I currently work in, where servers get paid hourly and back of house gets paid hourly, and both of them get tips. I think it evens out the playing field. And I think that's the goal, is that everyone makes a wage.
Thank you for dining with us tonight. You represent the ruin of my art and my life.